So now, welcome to our Friday night show with Ken and Cheryl. She's Cheryl.
He's Ken.
And so tonight we have a special guest with us. We have Kristin Secor. And we're going to talk about camping and some of the ways that she deals with the challenges she faces as she goes camping. And all that's coming up right after this. Well, maybe right after this. Try this again.
Well, I guess we don't have our show. We don't.
I guess the bumper is not going to play, so we'll bring Kristin into the show. So, Kristin, it's nice to have you with us. So, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and your challenges, and then we'll talk about all the places that you've been going lately.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me. So I'm Kristin, and I was born with a rare form of muscular dystrophy. So that affects my overall strength, my respiratory muscles. So I'm on a ventilator. So I'm used to traveling with breathing devices. And the way my muscular dystrophy affects me is with my endurance, strength, and, just overall health. So I have some mobility. I can walk with a cane for very short distance when it's perfectly flat. But most of the time when I'm out of the house, I use either a manual wheelchair or a mobility scooter. And I love camping. We do a lot of camping. And we go all over the place. I do international travel as well. I do all types of traveling, but I really love camping.
Yeah, and I noticed that, and I saw some pictures. In fact, I'll put up the screen so you can share. So you want to tell us? I guess we'll start. It should hopefully come up here in just a second.
So this first picture is a picture of my RV. We had it adapted. This is actually a lift. So it's a motorized lift, and this chair swings out through the door of the RV. I transfer from my manual wheelchair to this little chair that you see, and then the motorized lift lifts it up, and then it swings over the steps so that I don't have to do any steps to get into the RV.
Well, and that is very cool. I didn't realize that capability existed. I love the fact that it gives you a way to get in and out without dealing with the steps. Because that's one of the things Cheryl, she has some mobility, and she can get in and out of a coach like that or off a bus, but it's always a challenge, and so having a way to be able to get in and out is pretty slick. Now, you said you like to camp, and you don't normally think of camping as an accessible activity. So let's talk about where you go and how you do it.
Yeah, so there's actually a variety of adaptations you can do to a motorhome. This is just one of them. Some people actually have wheelchair lifts, and they widen the doorways to modify their RV. But this is the one that I use because I have some mobility. Some people use toil haulers, which naturally have a ramp in the back to get in, and then they just modify the restroom. So that's the first slide. I go to a lot of national parks. I really enjoy national parks. They usually have pretty good accessibility. So like this slide, this is actually at a national scenic lakeshore in Michigan, which is under the national park umbrella system. And this is a really cool program because they have a free all-terrain tracks chair that you can use to go hiking. So this is, as you can see, built like a tank essentially. And so it goes over tree roots, gravel, steep inclines, just about anything, honestly. And it's very secure. It doesn't tip. There's a harness you can use to strap yourself in if you don't have a lot of core strength. But it was a really cool program, and it's free for people to use. So the only requirement is you have to be able to transfer into the chair, and it does tip, and some of the arms will fold up for easier transfer. But that was one of the really cool things that I got to do at a national park. And this is another picture of that same scenic lakeshore. There's a scenic drive that you can do. That's Lake Michigan behind me. And you can see over here some of the sand dunes, which is how it gets its name.
Okay. Nice. I love that wheelchair. I hope maybe we'll get some of those in more parks.
Yeah, I really wish they do. The only other program that I'm aware of, there's a couple in Wisconsin, but there's one actually out in Colorado at Staunton State Park, I believe. I might be mispronouncing that. This is actually in North Dakota. I just did this trip last year, and this is Theodore Roosevelt National Park. It's a very beautiful park. Tons of buffalo and wildlife. They have wild mustangs and things like that. So it was really cool, very accessible. All the lookouts were accessible, had accessible parking, beautiful views. I believe this is Badlands in South Dakota. So I like to do when you're camping, you can really hit a lot of national parks and national sites along the way, which makes it really nice to break up the trip, see a lot of beautiful scenery, and have pretty good accessibility. Yes, I'm sorry for the beeping, Hazel. That's my ventilator. It doesn't always like when I talk, so I apologize for the beeping.
I don't know that it was your noise. It looked like she was saying that she was having a problem at her house, but
yeah. And it's interesting because Badlands is a place I've driven through a lot of times. I used to cover North Dakota and South Dakota for the manufacturer I worked for. I was a copier service representative for one of the major manufacturers, and I used to drive through that Badlands Park, going between down by Rapid City, going north up to the area around towards Minot, in that area up in the upper side of North Dakota, and like I said, it's very attractive.
Very beautiful. Tons of wildlife, bighorn sheep, buffalo. It's just, there's so much to see every time you drive through it. Even if you've been multiple times, you'll notice something different, and especially the time of day that you visit.
Yeah. I used to see a lot of antelope too. There would be a lot of the pronghorn, and they were funny because they didn't seem to mind if you were driving. They'd be pretty close to the road, but if you stopped, they got away from the road so quickly.
Yeah. And so one of the other things I like about the national parks and monuments, and this is Devil's Tower that you're saying right now in Wyoming. It's a really easy stop if you're traveling from Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota down to South Dakota. But what I like is that they have the access pass. So if you're not familiar with the access pass, it is a free pass that people with permanent disabilities can obtain by providing proof of residency in the United States, as well as proof of disability, and it will allow you lifetime free access to all the national parks and the national monuments, national historic sites, everything that falls under the national park umbrella.
I never knew about that. I really have to look into that.
Yeah, it's a really cool pass. I've made very good use out of it because, like I said, it's not only for the national parks, but everything that falls under that system. So, like Devil's Tower is included in that. So Devil's Tower is partially accessible. There's a trail that goes around the base, but it's steep in some places. So I did it in my mobility scooter with a little help here and there. I saw someone in a manual wheelchair with someone pushing her do it. So it is possible. It's just, a little more challenging. But it is a very pretty area. So this is Badlands for sure. And you can see the accessible boardwalk that goes out to some of the viewing areas, so you can really get on the edge of all this
Wow.
beautiful scenery.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's nice that they did that.
Yeah.
It's interesting. You talked about the being a little steep around that walkway.
Yeah.
We'll have video coming, but Cheryl and I were in San Pedro, and there's the South Koreans somewhere back in the 40s, 50s in that time frame gave the U.S. this great big huge bell, and it's called the Korean Bell Monument, and we went up to see that, and the hill that we climbed was not quite as steep as those are, but it felt that steep when I was pushing Cheryl up the hill.
Someone stopped and helped him push me half a block because it was pretty bad.
Yeah, it was pretty brutal. I was wishing we had a mobility scooter for that.
Yeah, for sure. And even sometimes on those it can be challenging. So this was one of the parks I visited out when I went to Colorado. This is Sand Dunes National Park. It's south of Colorado Springs. And so in the spring, you see this water that's down there. In the spring, the runoff water from the mountains creates this temporary river or pond. So people swim there. People actually climb the dunes, which are pretty steep. That's a person right at the base of that, and it looks like an ant because they're so huge. So people that are able-bodied can climb that, and they actually have sand sledding and sandboarding where you can slide down those dunes, which I did not try. But they one of the nice things about this park is they do have a free beach wheelchair that you can use so that you can actually get out on the dunes, or at least near the dunes. You might not have someone strong enough to push you up the dunes because, again, they are so steep and it's at a higher altitude, so you're going to have a harder time breathing while you're doing that as well. But it's a really nice service that they offer to do the beach chair.
Hey, maybe I could push myself part way up and then ride back down.
That'd be fun. I don't know that there are brakes on that wheelchair, but that would be fun.
Yeah, it'd be fun. might end up in the water.
Yeah. So this is one of my favorite parks. It's actually the first national park I went to. It's Acadia National Park in Maine. And this is a picture of one of the carriage roads. So back in the day, the elite of New York City, like the Rockefellers, actually had houses up here. And so they created carriage roads so they could just use their horse and buggy and kind of have a scenic ride throughout the park. Of course, it was before it was a national park back then. But they had all these carriage roads built, so there are some really easy roads that you can use a mobility scooter on. These are gravel roads, so it might be a little harder in a manual wheelchair. But a power chair or a mobility scooter, they were actually really quite nice and very scenic. All the trees and stuff.
Did you see any wild blueberries? I know that Maine is really kind of almost that area of the country is kind of famous for wild blueberry jam and
yes,
really good stuff.
I don't know that I saw any wild blueberries. We were there in June, so it might have been a little early for the blueberries. But we did get some blueberry jam, and they actually make a really delicious blueberry syrup that you can make put on pancakes. So it's maple syrup, but it has all these blueberries in them, and so Maine blueberries are a little different than the rest of America. They're very small, but very delicious, very sweet.
Yeah, we took a cruise up through New England, and I got some of the wild blueberry ice cream, and it was wonderful.
Yeah, very, very good. So one of the nice things on these carriage roads is as you're going through the park, you can look for these old stone bridges. These were made back, there's a variety of dates. I think this was in the 1920s that this was made. And again, it's part of that carriage road system, but they're still intact today, and they're really lovely to look at. They each have a special design, so they're each unique if you find them. And then
Nice.
That's so nice.
there are accessible trails in the park too. This is down by the Wild Gardens of Acadia. This is kind of like a marshy walk. So this is a boardwalk that they built through the marsh. It is great for people who like bird watching or just being in a marshy area. And it was really quite nice. So there are a number of trails they can do. There's Cadillac Mountain, which you drive up, and the lookout at the summit is accessible, which is really nice. And I think that's my last slide. So national parks have just a wonderful variety of things to offer. They really try to be accessible. Of course, not all of them are. I know there's a couple in Alaska that actually have no roads going into them. You can only hike in or fly in. So those obviously are not going to have accessibility. But in general, most national parks have a decent level of accessibility so you can get out and enjoy nature and really beautiful scenery.
Yeah, I was surprised you're talking about Alaska, and while there are definitely some areas you can't get to, I was surprised at the level of accessibility in Alaska in general. We had a young lady on, and she had some interesting stories, but she was talking about she got off the train in Talkeetna, which is up near Denali, and she said that they had an accessible taxi there in town. It's a little town out in the middle of a lot of wilderness, and they had an accessible taxi there. But she was talking about the things that she was able to see and do. There's accessible fishing piers, both on the river and on the in the ocean. There's just a lot of I would say I was very surprised at how accessible it is. We did something that was kind of interesting. You want to tell them about the
Boat ride.
well, the one where we went to the
Rainforest.
into the rainforest. Yeah.
Oh yeah, Alaska has a rainforest. It's not really a national park. It's part of it. The part that we visited was on private land. This family, a man that lives there now that has the business there, his family had moved there like 100 or so years ago, and so he was able to stay there. Although around him is like a national park rainforest. It's the only one in this, it's part of the world. But they take you there on a boat ride. And the boat was not particularly accessible, but if you could do a few steps, you could get on the boat, and then they fold your wheelchair up. And then when you get there and you get off the boat, it can be a steep hill depending on the tide levels. And so they had like a UTV kind of a thing, and they let me sit on the back of that, and they took me up the hill on that. And so that made it possible. It's not that it was really long, but it was steep. But when you get into and then they have a restaurant there, and even they have a place there where people can stay and fish if they want to stay overnight. But they have like boardwalks through the marshy area, kind of like what you're talking about there. You couldn't walk through that area, but they did build boardwalks through it. And they have a huge, very old tree, the oldest cypress, I think, in Alaska's there. Maybe, I forget how, they thought it was 400 years old or something.
I think they said it was 400 years old.
Really old. And it's very big. And so that was a lot of fun. And then after you take the little tour and they tell you about the plants and the trees, then they had a kind of like I like to say like a North Carolina style seafood fest afterwards, where you sit at the table and they put the paper down and they dump all the seafood out. And it was very nice. And they made it as accessible as they could, considering it's a fairly small venue, And so I was happy that I was able to do that.
Yeah, it was funny in Alaska, and we'll be going back again this year to do some more things and see some more things. But in the train in Alaska was kind of interesting because they had in Anchorage they had a ramp where you could get up and get onto the train, and then inside the train they had an elevator for wheelchairs, so that they could get you up to the observation car, which is pretty cool. But in Seward, they didn't have a ramp, so they had a manual elevator.
Manual crank
they
down.
pull it up, you pull that on it, and then they lower it through. you're going the other way, they'd raise you with the with
It
the.
worked very easily. It didn't seem to be difficult for the lady to run that at all. So that was a lot of fun.
I
Yeah,
think I've been on
we're
one
looking
of
forward
those.
to it.
We did a train ride when I was in Colorado through the Royal Gorge, and they had a manual lift like that to get me on the train, and it was really neat. But that's great to hear about Alaska. I have not been there yet. I am going next year, so I'm very excited about that. Um, I just visited 2 national parks on Hawaii, which were really nice. Volcanoes National Park actually had more accessibility than I thought it would. They have 3 accessible trails that you can do throughout the park, and most of the overlooks were accessible. And there was even lava flow, so we got to see lava in one of the craters. That one was a little tricky. Most of it,
Wow.
it was like a mile paved road to get to it, and at the very end was very dense gravel on an incline. So it was a little challenging in a manual wheelchair. I didn't have my scooter with me at that time. But what I find is that when I travel, other people, even able-bodied people, really want you to be able to see and do as much as you can. So whether they're tour operators or other tourists, I found people to be very willing to help, very considerate, very nice, and just an overall great experience.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we find is that people really go out of their way to be helpful. Um, it's been interesting. So, how are you going up camping in Alaska? Are you going to? How are you planning on traveling
So
to
I'm
Alaska
doing
next
a
year?
cruise tour. That's quite a long ways to drive to go camping, and some of the roads aren't always. You got to pick and choose your roads to see what ones can handle a motorhome. Because ours is like a 27-foot motorhome, a Class A style, so it's like a bus style. Um,
Yeah,
so, for time's sake, I am flying into Vancouver and then doing a 7-day cruise and then a land tour with Princess Cruises because I've heard they're really good in Alaska. So, I'll be doing that. And then, but later this year, we will be doing a RV trip out west to Wyoming to Yellowstone National Park and Grand Tetons. We'll probably hit some national sites along the way too. I'm hoping to stop at that state park in Colorado to do the trash tour again because that was just incredible. It really felt like you weren't disabled at all. It just felt like you were differently abled. You could do anything that someone that was able-bodied could do. You were just doing it differently.
Nice.
yeah, very nice.
Nice.
Yeah, you'll like Alaska. There's so many cool things to do because in on the channel you can check it out. I've got about 40 videos about accessible travel in Alaska. Not that I'm
Mm-hmm.
obsessed with Alaska or anything, but there's probably more videos about Alaska than any other subject there. We're gonna do the kind of the reverse of the plan you're on because we're gonna
Mm-hmm.
fly to Fairbanks and there's in Fairbanks there's a couple of things you can do that are pretty cool. There's a riverboat that's completely accessible. That does it kind of it's like a turn of the century. The person that operates it now. It was his grandfather that was running. He was hauling freight on the. I think it was the Talkeetna River, maybe. No, not Talkeetna. Um, anyway, on the river. Not, it wasn't on the Yukon, but they were hauling freight on this with the paddle boat, and then that kind of died out, and they did a little bit of tourism, and they kind of didn't do anything for a while. Then they came back. Now they have 3 paddle boats, and they stop and visit a replica Native American encampment. And they have Native Americans that talk about their life. When they were outside of civilization. But then he also has a train that goes through like the Yukon mining areas and shows the different ways that they would mine for gold. And at the end of it, you get to do some gold panning, and all of that's accessible. There's accessible van tours into Denali. We're going to do that. So I'll have videos from all of these.
Okay.
The train from if you're going on Princess, you'll go into Whittier.
Mm-hmm.
The ride from Whittier into Anchorage and then up north will be amazing. Um, we're like I said, we're gonna go to Seward instead of Whittier. They're kind of like on the same area of coast, but there's like a mountain that separates them. So all of that's going to be amazing. Like I said, Ketchikan's the only place that you'll visit that has any real mobility challenges, and Ketchikan's just hilly. And that's where we went out into the rainforest. Skagway's the town of Skagway is about perfectly flat, and it's most of it is a historical district. So all the buildings that are owned by the federal government in that area are all accessible. So there's a bunch of stuff you can see and do there. Juneau's pretty cool. You can get out. You can get pretty close, even in a manual wheelchair. You can get pretty close to Nugget Falls, which is right by Mendenhall Glacier. Mendenhall's got a great visitor center. It's a great place to go whale watching. So, yeah, you'll.
The one where if you had like a scooter, you'd be better than a wheelchair.
Yeah,
because we used a wheelchair and it was a kind of a long trip.
Yeah, it's scooter's a better choice. And what I would suggest is if you're gonna take, and Cheryl and I will do this sometimes. We'll take her manual wheelchair because there's sometimes a manual wheelchair is easier than a scooter. We'll rent a scooter.
Right.
And there was one that we really liked. I don't know if you saw the video, but it was the Will CI because it is a powered chair. And Cheryl had a lot of fun driving that. Now I'm pretty sure she was airborne a couple of times with it.
Going fast. I didn't get to use it outside like on gravel, so I don't know if it's better than some of the other scooters with bigger wheels that might be better on gravel. That's
I was just going to ask that. Yeah, because isn't the path to the base of Nugget Falls, isn't that mostly gravel?
It's hard pack and then it turns to gravel. So you want something you can, but
yes, I stopped a ways back because you do have to get up. It does reach a point where you have to take some steps and it was
a step. There's just a hump in the road.
Yeah, but there was some. I'd stopped. I didn't get as close as everybody else did. I stayed back about 50 feet farther from back because it did have some larger steps and rocks and things that I didn't want to have to deal with.
Right.
But I did get to see it, but I didn't get as close as they were like just right directly across from it. And I was kind of past maybe like a little bit of a cliff between me and it.
Yeah. But, so you'll enjoy Alaska. Like I said, Alaska, before we went and before I started focusing on accessibility, I had not realized how accessible. Like I said, Alaska is much more accessible than you would think based on what you see. Now, obviously, there are places that are not accessible, but there are a lot of accessible and fun things to do.
Did you finish showing all your pictures?
I did. Yep. And I found I found the same thing about Hawaii. I wasn't sure how accessible it would be. I mean, I knew it was in the United States, so it has the same ADA laws as all the other states, but there were quite a few beach wheelchair opportunities. They have an accessible surf program, which I thought was really cool. I would have done it, but ventilator and water really don't mix, so I wasn't able to try that out. But it sounded really cool. I actually interviewed the organization for a post I'm going to do in my blog. So it was a lot better than I thought in Hawaii, for sure.
I had a question because it's been a really long time, for the most part, since I've done many national parks, and I was never handicapped when I had really done a lot of them. So would you say the bathrooms are really quite accessible, or do you need to plan yourself extra time to find an accessible bathroom at times, or do you not have that problem because of your trailer?
No, that's a great question. So usually when I camp, we tow a car behind the trailer because parking that trailer is a nightmare. And even if you can, you're not going to be able to have an accessible spot for the trailer, and you still need room to use the chairlift that I use, just like someone would with a ramp. So we tow a car behind. And most of the actual national parks have accessible restrooms, and when you go in, they'll give you a map, and that map clearly indicates where all the accessible restrooms are within the park. Sometimes they're not the fanciest. They could be a vault toilet, which is basically a fancy porta potty. But it is accessible. There's room to go in and turn around. There's grab bars within them and things like that. Some of the
Okay.
like national lake shores, like at Sleeping Bear Dunes that I had pictures of, that one did not have any accessible restrooms within the scenic drive. So some of them you have to plan accordingly, but most of the actual national parks have good restroom facilities. Usually the visitor centers are all accessible, and if nothing else, you can usually find accessible restrooms at the visitor center.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for letting me know.
Yeah, no problem.
that's it is funny because people look at me a little funny, and I think they look at Cheryl and I both funny sometimes because they'll see us. We'll be photographing the wheelchair in the bathroom.
Oh, yeah.
When nobody else is.
Yeah, I mean, no one else is somebody else is using it, but it's just that when you need an accessible restroom, it's nice to know if there is really one that works. I was talking with somebody a couple of weeks ago that does accessible safaris in Africa, and they have to call it a porta potty would be an exaggeration, but they have a way to make they have a chair that you can transfer to, and an accessible, like a screen that they can put around you. So even out in the bush on a safari, they can find you a place where you can take care of nature's call. And I was like, okay, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah. And, people that are able-bodied might not think of it, but sometimes depending on what your disability is can affect your bladder. So sometimes you have to go more often than most people. Sometimes it's hard to hold it depending on your muscular control. So, these are important issues.
Yeah, they are. We'll talk a little bit about our trip this time because we're on Carnival Panorama, which is sister to the Carnival Horizon, which is where we were at the end of January. And we've had a good cruise. I was pleased with accessibility in Mazatlan. The roads were sometimes a little crowded, but there's a walking trail, so we walked pretty much all over downtown with the wheelchair. There were a couple of I don't think
There wasn't really in Mexico. Also, the one thing about Mexico is it's really hard to find an accessible bathroom. So we were off the ship for several hours. I didn't find a bathroom I could use. The toilets were too low. There were no bars. Finally, I just said, let's just go back to the ship. But other than that, getting around in Mazatlan, they have volunteers that wear blue shirts, and it's called Blue Line. They have like blue lines on the road that take you down to the downtown part. And then from there, they have volunteers that show you how to get around. And we were able to do all that in the wheelchair. Just have to watch out for the potholes on the sidewalk. It was tolerable. It was good. And the drivers were very nice, letting us in if we had to go off and get around a curb or something. But yeah, it's not. You just need to plan shorter trips maybe, or some other way to use the facilities, like adapt it yourself somehow.
Yeah. Right.
But yeah, but I really enjoyed the trip. That's the only thing that I'd say. One thing that I want to say about this though, if you're here this time of year and you're coming to like Las Cabos or Mazatlan, this area, everyone who took a whale watching tour was absolutely thrilled. They saw lots of whales, and so we had not known that there would be so many down here, and so that's one thing we didn't do that we wish we had done.
Yeah. And again, we saw some boats that were obviously geared up to take people that had some challenges because they had ramps instead of steps to get up to the boat.
And Las Cabos has 2 accessible
tenders.
Yeah,
it's a tender
very
port.
Nice. It's very easy. They have a lot of tenders, but 2 of them are big, large tenders that you just
roll on, roll off.
Real nice.
And
That's
that
good
is
to
an
know. I always
improvement
wondered about it.
Yeah. In the past, the information I'd seen said that there wasn't any way to tender in a wheelchair in Cabo, and now Now they have at least two boats that you can just, like I said, roll off, roll on. They're basically double deckers, and then when you get to port, there's a ramp. Now again, the ramps are a little steep, but they're doable, and they, the staff on the boat or the staff on the ship will help you get on and off without a problem.
And they're large. I mean, they were large tenders. So if you had a large group with you, you could all still tender together. It was very nice. We were there for a really short time at Los Cabos, so we didn't really see very much. And they said that the traffic was really bad that day. So some things we planned, it wasn't even possible to do, but which we regret. But next time. And what was the first? Puerto Vallarta.
Puerto Vallarta, yeah. It was the port areas, and all three of them were easily accessible. Was it in?
That's the one we did Blue Line. Los Cabos, we did nothing. I kept trying. My mind is like, what happened to Puerto Vallarta? I know we did that.
We did that trip over to the other side of the port. There's like a shuttle that runs, and it was accessible because the port's like divided in half, and we were on the far side of it, and so there was like a shuttle that ran you, but it was accessible. You could just take the wheelchair and ride up on it.
Secrets and Dreams.
Yeah, we toured a couple hotel properties.
Yeah, but they had a nice shuttle. There's one of the ports is very simple. There really wasn't very much there, just a few tents, and then you can go outside and shop right there. There's a Walmart, there's supermercados, a Sam's Club. But if you take the little trolley, like the free trolley, which could you roll up on? Yeah, they rolled me up on it. Yeah, they rolled. They had you rolled right up the ramp onto the trolley. Takes you down to a more nicer looking shopping area indoors, real nice, and then also a flea market area is right there, and that was all accessible.
Yeah. So it's been, and the Horizons.
Panorama.
The Panorama. I get them confused, but the Panorama's been really accessible. We haven't run into anything that we couldn't get where we needed to go. So.
They were able to give me a wet room and nice room. It's we have two portholes, and but we're hardly ever in our room. So, but it's been very nice, and the staff is always very helpful on Carnival.
All right. Well, I really appreciate you taking time to be with us, Kristin. And for those that haven't checked it out, Kristin does have an article on my website. She wrote a blog article for us, and we appreciate it very much. So check out travelingwithachair.com and look under blog, and you'll find right now Kristin's at the top of the list. So you want to check out her article, and we will see everybody next week.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming.